a world in which we face significant and enduring threats, these challenging times require leadership from the United States. As Secretary Tillerson said when he came before this committee, to achieve the stability that is foundational to peace and security in the 21st century, American leadership must not only be renewed, it must be asserted. And will be aided in the assertion of that leadership by two of our abiding strengths, our allies and our values. We have relationships with allies in this hemisphere and across the globe that extend back many decades and have been the cornerstone of our national security in the post-war era. But our greatest asset is our commitment to the fundamental values expressed at the founding of our nation, the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These basic human rights are the bedrock of our republic and at the heart of American leadership in the world. Should I be confirmed, I commit to work with the members of this committee as the administration implements an American foreign policy that is worthy of our ideals as a people, ideals that have been handed down by the many generations that preceded us. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Just one question from me. Do you commit to appear and testify upon request from this committee?
I do, Mr. Chairman.
With that, I'm going to reserve my time for interjections and turn to our distinguished ranking member, Ben Cardin.
Mr. Sullivan, first of all, thank you for the testimony today, because you make it very clear at the end your commitment to American values, and I appreciate that. I want to drill down a little bit on that, as I told you I would in our private meeting. I quoted from Senator McCain in my opening statement. I thought part of his experience and the way that he related to the fact that as a prisoner of war, where he was trying to be broken by the enemy, it was the belief in our values that kept him strong, and that he felt that if America was transactional, if that's how we do business rather than our values, then why shouldn't prisoners of war be transactional also and give up our country in order to achieve more comfort for themselves? They didn't do that. Our soldiers don't do that, and our diplomats shouldn't do that. So I want to hear from you your commitment that as we deal with Russia, as we deal with China, as we deal with countries around the world that we need to deal with, but don't share our commitment to universal values, how America's foreign policy will always be framed in the values that have made us the great nation we are.
Senator, our values, as I said in my opening statement, are the bedrock of our republic. Before we became a world power, before we had the world-class military that you mentioned, before we became the economic juggernaut that we are today, we had our values. We achieved those successes because all of that was based on our values as Americans, expressed in the Declaration of Independence and in our Constitution.
So I'm going to tell you some specific examples. You'll have a chance to visit a lot of countries if you're confirmed. Visiting with the opposition, visiting with NGOs that are not particularly liked by the government, visiting with people who have been persecuted by the government is a clear sign that America stands on the side of universal human rights. Are you prepared to make those types of visual commitments so that our leadership is maintained?
Not only am I prepared to make that commitment going forward, but I have made that commitment as in my prior service in government. I'm a Roman Catholic. When I travel, I always go to Mass and meet with Catholics in the country in which I travel, and that includes countries where the Catholic Church is, for lack of a better word, oppressed, in particular China.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The Congress has taken steps to try to give the administration greater tools. In one case, the Magnitsky Global Human Rights Bill that was championed by Senator McCain and myself is now available globally, and it's a congressional initiative. It allows the State Department to promote names of individuals who have violated basic human rights for sanctions here in the United States. Our leadership has been recognized globally, and other countries are following suit, doing the exact same thing that America has done. But it requires a robust administration. Are you prepared to use that tool to advance American human rights values?
Yes, I am, Senator.
There's legislation that we're working on in Congress that is to deal with corruption. We have a model with dealing with trafficking, and I applaud many members of this committee that were deeply involved, including our chairman, who is passionate about stopping modern-day slavery. The TIP report is a very valuable tool in advancing our goals on fighting trafficking in humans. We want to use a similar model to fight corruption. Corruption is growing, unfortunately, in too many places in the world. No country is immune from corruption. No country is immune from trafficking. There are countries that are taking steps to protect their country against trafficking, and there's countries that are taking steps to protect their country against corruption. Having guides in how we conduct our foreign policy, because corruption is a cancer in a country that leads to instability. Are you prepared to work with members of this committee on legislation that would give greater tools for evaluating how well we're doing in fighting corruption globally?
Yes, I am, Senator.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rubio.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your willingness to serve once again in government. I want to continue on the theme of human rights. I think it is an essential part of our foreign policy. And I think you know this from your time in government and outside of it, that so many of the groups around the world who are fighting for the principles that we as a nation stand for, democracy, the free press, the freedom of religion, freedom of expression, they look for America for inspiration. I've been touched deeply by examples of that just in the last 3 months. Sometimes we give these speeches on the Senate floor, we don't think anybody hears them, and then you get to interact with someone that was recently released from a prison, and they tell you that what we did in a resolution or in a hearing or on the Senate floor was impactful and ran counter to the oppressor's message to them that they don't matter to anybody. Nobody cares about you. And while I think it's important that we here in the Senate continue to stand for these principles, I also think it's important we have a State Department that is structured in a way that shows that this is a priority of the United States. There's no shortage of these, obviously. In Iran, we know about their grotesque human rights record. In Syria, we've seen the horrifying crimes committed against innocent civilians. We also have challenges with some allies in the region, and I think perhaps that is some of the messaging that the Secretary was pointing to. Egypt is an ally. It is also a human rights violator, and it is important for us as their ally to tell them that that is an unsustainable position moving forward. Saudi Arabia is a country we work with very closely, and yet it is not a human rights star, to say the least. In Asia, we're obviously talk a lot about the North Korean nuclear weapon. We don't talk nearly enough about the forced labor camps that exist there, a horrifying reality. And of course, in China, we could have days and days of testimony about the thousands of political prisoners. In Europe, obviously, we're aware of Russia's horrifying human rights record. We've seen recently in the pro-Russian areas of Chechnya how LGBT gay men have been rounded up and put in jail. And again, another horrifying instance. But in our own hemisphere, even as we stand now, we see horrifying human rights violations in Venezuela. Dozens of people that have been in jail, some for upwards of 3 years, total ignoring the constitution of that country, the security forces firing on protesters in the street, and of course, one that I know is near to you and to me, the issue of Cuba. Where we still, despite all this celebratory language about an opening, there are people in jail in Cuba. There are people being rounded up in Cuba. There are people being oppressed systematically in Cuba. I believe the Cuban people are deserving of freedom and democracy just like the people in the Dominican Republic have. Just like the people in Haiti just had an election. Just like the people in Colombia. Just like the people. Why are Cubans any less worthy of those basic freedoms? And what I would ask you to share with the committee is what you shared with me on the issue of human rights, in particular with Cuba, but broader. This is not just an issue that is of academic interest. In your own family, through marriage, you actually have a gentleman who experienced the horrifying violation of human rights, who experienced being jailed by an oppressive regime, and who is a Floridian. And you shared that story with me, and to me that's very important because it tells me that we have someone here before us who understands human rights and oppression, not because he read about it in a book, because he knows and loves someone who himself has been a victim of the denial of freedom. And I would just invite you to share with the committee for a moment the story of this incredible man and the impact that he's had on your thinking with regards to all of this.
Thank you, Senator. You're referring to my wife and my mother-in-law's uncle, Jose Pujals, who was a political prisoner in Cuba for 27 years, over 27 years. He was one of the so-called plantados in Castro's prisons. He spent
Explain the plantado. What...
Plantados were those prisoners who refused to cooperate, refused to wear prison uniforms. They were planted in their cells, and he was in solitary confinement for 7 years. He was sustained by his religious faith, his Catholic faith, his wife, who, despite the fact that she had the opportunity to leave Cuba and come to the United States, stayed on the island so that she could, in those few opportunities when she could, meet with him. He was released from prison a week after my wife and I got married in 1988, and he's still alive today. He's 92, almost 93 years old, and he's a great inspiration to our family.
Service and for your strong to our basic values and your willingness to take up this work on behalf of the American people. I am encouraged by your statement in your opening that you've remained in awe of our Foreign Service officers who venture into dangerous places on our behalf, and I'm encouraged by the stories you shared with me and that you just shared in response to Senator Rubio's questioning. So I look forward to working with you and to finding ways that we can together continue to speak up about human rights, about democracy, to meet with and to advocate for the Foreign Service officers around the world who today are a little anxious about their place in the State Department and are looking for a clarity about support for their service and their mission. Just 3 quick questions, if I might. We talked a little bit about your service in the Commerce Department. How do you view the Power Africa initiative? I think it has been a successful public-private partnership that helps bring private sector ingenuity and effort into the basic development challenge of infrastructure on the continent. Is that something that you think the Trump administration might well embrace and continue to move forward?
Yes, Senator, I agree, and we discussed that yesterday in our meeting, and I'd also add that we discussed sub-Saharan Africa as a place that we can't lose sight of the opportunities that are there, both for the sake of promoting human development, economic development in those many countries, but also as protection of U.S. interests, both national security and economic prosperity. So I look forward to working with you on that, Senator.
Thank you. One of the things I'm concerned about is that in the absence of Russia paying some price for its interference in our 2016 election, arguably in France's election just this past week, and potentially in the election in Germany that is upcoming, that they'll simply continue and become more aggressive and more robustly engaged. How do you think we could best deter Russia from future cyber attacks and efforts to subvert democracy throughout our Western European allies and here in the United States?
Well, Senator, it's a persistent threat that we face. Most recently from Russia in our election, and as you mentioned in the elections in Europe and France and the Netherlands, and upcoming elections in Germany and Italy next year, or maybe later this year. As the Secretary has said, Secretary Tillerson has met with Foreign Minister Lavrov, with President Putin, raised these issues directly with the Russians. I believe we have to be robust in our response to this intrusion into our democracy. When we talk about basic human rights, our republic is premised on a representative democracy. Interference with our political processes is simply unacceptable. It's a profound threat to our way of life, and we need to respond as robustly as we can using all of the means we have at our disposal.
I'm encouraged to hear you say that because I've heard expressions of concern from representatives of some of our European allies, particularly those closest to Russia geographically, who say that if we're not going to stand up and defend our democracy, how can they count on us to defend theirs? And that sense of uncertainty about our future actions, I think, makes all of us weaker. Last, what do you think we should be doing to restrain Iran's destabilizing actions in the Middle East and throughout the region? I think they continue to engage in destabilizing actions throughout the region, in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, and elsewhere, and coming up with a sustained bipartisan approach to Iran is, I think, one of our major foreign policy challenges.
I agree, Senator. Iran policy is currently under review in the administration. I would say that Iran has been a persistent threat to U.S. national interests, national security interests in many areas, including those that you mentioned. The Secretary has sent a letter to this committee regarding Iranian compliance with the JCPOA. I thought Secretary Mattis best characterized the JCPOA in his testimony before the Armed Services Committee, in which he described it as an imperfect arms control agreement, not a treaty of friendship. We have a lot of other problems that we need to address with Iran beyond the JCPOA and their nuclear program. We need to make sure that they comply with the terms of that agreement, but we have a number of other problems that we need to address with them, whether it's their sponsorship of terrorism, human rights in their own country, ballistic missile programs, the list goes on.
I agree, and I look forward to having you testify before this committee in the future and to hearing that you visit with Foreign Service officers as well as with the political opposition, human rights activists, and NGOs in your travels around the world. Thank you, Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you.
Senator Flake.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to meet with you and also to hear your testimony here, your willingness to serve. I enjoyed the discussion that Senator Rubio had with regard to Cuba. Many of us feel strongly about ways that we can hasten change in Cuba and move toward democracy. I happen to think that some of the measures taken by the last administration with regard to allowing Cuban-American travel, allowing increase in remittances, have allowed a lot of Cubans, and I think we've gone from virtually very little Cuban employment outside of the government sector to today about 1 in 4 Cubans is employed in the so-called private sector in Cuba, running bed and breakfasts or private restaurants or beauty shops, auto repair facilities, and have some modicum of independence from the government, more than they had before. And I think that that's a good development. There are obviously still human rights abuses that take place. The question is, how do we best ensure that freedom is hastened and we move forward? And I know that those policies are being reviewed, and I hope that we'll look at the whole picture there and see where we are as opposed to where we were a few years ago. We've had policies in place for 50 years that haven't moved the needle very far until now. With regard to the State Department and some of the things that you'll be involved with, there's a report recently noting that there are 67 special envoy, special representative, and special coordinator positions at the department, most of them outside of the regular bureaus, and a handful of them, only a handful of them, approximately 20, have been authorized by Congress. From a managerial perspective, how do we deal with this? Is there going to be an effort to wind down some of these special envoy positions? Just as a matter of note, they seem pretty duplicative. For example, we have a special envoy and coordinator for international energy affairs, as well as the special envoy for climate change and the special representative for environmental and water resources. This is over and above any other positions that we have at state. And then we have a special envoy for North Korean human rights issues, and a special envoy for the six-party talks, and a special representative for North Korea policy. Again, this is all in addition to regular State Department positions. From a managerial perspective, how are we dealing with these special envoy positions?
Thank you, Senator Flake. This is all part of this Secretary Tillerson's review of the mission of the department with the intent of basically bringing the department into the 21st century to address the challenges we have now. He's reached out to all employees of the department, having listening sessions with employees of the department to discuss the best way to define and accomplish our missions. With respect to the special envoy positions you've mentioned, Senator Flake, my concern, without addressing any particular office, is that when an office like that is created outside of the chain of command in the bureaucracy, it removes some level of accountability for those individuals who've been nominated by the president, reviewed by this committee, and confirmed, whether they serve at the assistant secretary or undersecretary level. We then appoint a special envoy for a particular issue who is outside that chain of command. This committee has not reviewed that person's qualifications. And it, in many ways, will undermine the leadership and the authority of those individuals who've been put in positions of substantial authority, because there's somebody outside of that chain of authority who's got responsibility for that narrow issue.
Well, that's my concern as well. I hope that we can move forward and make some changes here. Or my colleague just mentioned maybe we need a special envoy for special envoys, and it would. But absent that, we've got to get a handle on this. With only 20 of the 67 even authorized by Congress, and so many very duplicative, it would seem that a fully functioning, right-functioning State Department would seek to get some of its power and authority back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I would point out it's not just the envoys, but in many cases, very, very large staffs that support them. And we had testimony in a prior hearing where, from Republican and Democrat witnesses who had served at the State Department, that in many cases, these envoys were put in place to work around folks that otherwise couldn't perform in those roles. So I do hope you'll look closely at that, and appreciate the top-to-bottom review that's taking place. Senator Menendez.
Congratulations on your nomination, and I look forward to continuing the conversation. We started last week. Along with many others in this committee, I am deeply concerned about the lack of senior management positions that have yet to be filled at the State Department, and we welcome the opportunity to move forward with many more nominees, because I believe leaving senior positions that require Senate-confirmed, empowered individuals vacant undermines the ability of the department to carry out its mission, which ultimately compromises our foreign policy and our national security objectives. So this is a department for those of us who care deeply about foreign policy and the men and women who dedicate their lives to serving this country overseas. It's critically important that we see senior leadership who also values the mission of the State Department, will fight for its employees, its proper place in the national security apparatus, and its budget. So my question is, are you that person?
I am, Senator.
And you're committed to those goals?
I am committed to making the State Department the preeminent force to protect American values and promote American values in the world.
So, given your experience at the Commerce Department in the private sector, you come to some degree with a greater business orientation towards foreign policy. One of the things that I found in my 25 years in Congress is that sanctions can be a powerful tool in terms of peaceful diplomacy arsenal. I know that you have experience advising clients on sanctions compliance in Russia, Cuba, just to mention a couple. Do you believe sanctions are an effective tool of foreign policy?
Absolutely.
Do you believe that the network of sanctions we have in place on adversarial countries like Russia and Iran should be kept in place at this time?
I believe they should be reviewed to make sure they're adequate. Kept in place and potentially ratcheted up as necessary.
Okay. Now, I want to echo the remarks of the ranking member. One of the hallmarks of my career has been human rights and democracy globally. And, most of us who pay attention to foreign policy recognize that leading with our values, including prioritizing human rights in our diplomacy, is a critical part of promoting our national security. So I'm really concerned about Secretary Tillerson's comments. I'm also concerned that, notwithstanding his comments, I haven't seen so far in the first 4 or 5 months human rights and democracy raised very often. And there's no question that there are times that there may be an immediate national security goal in which that must take precedence. But history has proven unequivocally that countries who share our values of human rights, democratic governance, fundamental freedoms, make more stable countries. They make more prosperous countries. They're less likely to create war on their neighbors or potentially against us. Now, we have somehow forgotten that history at times. We have engaged with dictators and tyrants. And in the short term, it may have served us. But in the long term, boy, are we paying huge consequences for it. Huge consequences for it. And I could rattle off a series of countries in which we did that. If you are sitting in el Combinado del Este in Cuba, believe me, you want someone speaking about human rights and democracy. If you are being human trafficked by some slave trafficker, whether for sex or labor, you want somebody speaking out about human rights and democracy. If you're struggling inside of your country in Southeast Asia to change the essence of your life under a government that is totalitarian, you want somebody to speak out about human rights and democracy. So I hope that what I heard your comments to me, others that have said for the record, I cannot emphasize it enough, because we need someone who has the moral clarity that Nikki Haley has. I voted for her even though I didn't think she had a lot of foreign policy experience, or any. I'm not sure I would have hired her for my senior foreign policy person. But I think she's outstanding. But she has moral clarity. And that moral clarity can ultimately drive us in the right direction. And I hope that you have that moral clarity as the number 2 person at the State Department.
Thank you, Senator.
Just on that note, we had some issues, and we've had continuing discussions on the TIP report. I think most of us felt like political interference took place to accommodate the TPP as it relates to certain countries on the TIP report itself. Matter of fact, I don't think it. I'm pretty certain that did occur. Since that time, we've had a much different relationship with the State Department under 2 administrations as it relates to that. I just wish and hope you will confirm the fact that you will do everything in your power to assure us that the TIP report will be done with the utmost of integrity, and when you meet with foreign officials, it will be an issue that you bring up when that is necessary.
I will, Senator, and I know that Secretary Tillerson feels that way as well, as he said to this committee.
Okay. Senator Young.
Mr. Sullivan, I enjoyed our visit together in our office, and thank you again for your interest in serving. There's a matter that's come to my attention since our meeting I'd like to bring up in this hearing. On April 21st of this year, the Ethiopian government issued an order to suspend indefinitely international adoptions from their country. According to our State Department, this has left dozens of U.S. families in the late stages of the adoption process unable to obtain the necessary paperwork to bring home their legally adopted children. This includes the Oren family from my home state of Indiana. They have successfully adopted their son under Ethiopian law, but are unable to bring that son home to Indiana because of the Ethiopian government, which is unwilling to issue the paperwork necessary to receive an exit visa. As a father of 4 young children, I take this especially seriously, as all Americans should. In an email this morning, Mrs. Oren wrote the following: "We met, interacted with, and began the attachment process with our son while we were in Ethiopia. He is almost 4 years old. He knows we're his parents and that he was supposed to come home with us on our trip. He was upset and confused when we had to say goodbye, leaving him in an orphanage while we had to return to the States without him." Now, I had an opportunity yesterday to speak with the Ethiopian ambassador about this issue, and my hope is that it can be resolved quickly. And so, Mr. Sullivan, if it's not resolved quickly, once confirmed, will you work with my office to not only elevate this issue, but to make clear to the Ethiopian government at the highest level that this is important, and that we need to resolve this issue? We need their assistance, especially for families like the Orens who have already legally adopted their children when this order was issued.
Senator Young, if confirmed, I would be honored to do so.
Thank you. Mr. Sullivan, I'm a strong supporter of the international affairs budget. I've made that really clear, as have so many of my colleagues on this committee. As of yesterday, the General Accountability Office lists 132 recommendations, including 22 priority recommendations for the Department of State that have not been implemented or fully implemented. Some of these open recommendations go back to 2011. Among other issues, these recommendations relate to important topics such as international food assistance, human trafficking, fraud oversight, management challenges, diplomatic security, North Korean sanctions, and terrorism. In order to maintain strong support for international affairs among the American people, they're going to insist upon proper and responsible stewardship of every single dollar we spend on that account. So, Mr. Sullivan, as the nominee to serve as Deputy Secretary of State, which at least historically has played a very important role with respect to some of these management and budgetary challenges, do you agree that this is important for this committee to have full visibility on the status of these open recommendations?
Yes, I do, Senator Young.
Okay. Well, that's why I, along with Senators Menendez, Rubio, and Coons, introduced legislation S-418, the Department of State and United States Agency for International Development Accountability Act of 2017. Mr. Sullivan, once confirmed, do you commit to providing, as this legislation asks that we do, providing to this committee and to my office without delay detailed written unclassified updates regarding the status of all open GAO recommendations for the Department of State?
Senator Young, if confirmed, yes, I do. I take GAO reports, IG reports very seriously when I was Deputy Secretary of Commerce, and will do so as Deputy Secretary of State if confirmed.
Okay. And further, for any recommendation State has decided to adopt, will you provide a timeline for implementation and an explanation for any delay?
Of course, Senator, I would consider that part of our interaction with you and members of this committee.
And for those recommendations State has decided not to implement or fully implement, will you provide a detailed justification, sir?
Certainly.
All right, thank you. I have a bit of remaining time here. In your prepared statement, you mentioned the 1979 seizure of our embassy in Tehran and the assassination of Ambassador Spike Dubs in Afghanistan. On March 9, the IG for the Department of State, Steve Linick, testified before the State and Foreign Ops Subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee. In his written testimony, the IG cited systemic issues in the department related to physical security measures. The IG cited a lack of coordination and an inability to track and prioritize physical security needs. More than 4.5 years after the terrorist attack in Benghazi on our diplomatic facility, and with events of 1979 in mind, would you agree that the Department of State can and must do better when it comes to physical security and emergency action plans at our posts overseas?
Senator, I would have no higher priority if confirmed as Deputy Secretary of State than to protect our men and women that we send abroad on our behalf.
Have you reviewed this IG testimony, sir?
I have not, but will make that a priority if confirmed.
That was my follow-up. Thank you. I yield back.
You agreed to a couple of questions back. Let me just ask you, do you have any sense of the contours of the top-to-bottom review that's taking place, and any sense of what type of realignments might take place within the State Department?
In my discussions with the Secretary, he's made clear that he has no preconceived ideas on what the outcome should be. He's started this interaction with all the employees of the department to get their feedback and their input, and I look forward to working with him on that.
Do you have any sense of when that'll be complete?
I haven't spoken to the Secretary about that, but my goal would be to have it completed as quickly as humanly possible.
Is that having any impact, from what you can tell, on appointing assistant secretaries and other positions there?
I'm not involved in the process, the selection process now. My perception as an outsider is that any slowness in making appointments is not related to the review of the department's mission and its structure that's ongoing. And I commit, if I am confirmed, to making sure that those personnel appointments are moved forward as quickly as possible.
Yeah. So let me, my sense is they've actually selected most of those positions prior to you being there. That's my sense, and they're going to be forthcoming soon. But you don't have any sense of when the top to bottom review will be complete, and you'll have a layout as to how the new State Department, if you will, is going to function?
I haven't spoken to the Secretary about the timing of what he thinks the timing should be. We've talked about the mechanics and the process that he's going through. I haven't had that conversation with him yet, but I look forward to it, and to also working with you and members of this committee on making sure that that review is done as expeditiously as possible.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to be happy to pick up on that line of questioning. First, thank you for your willingness to serve. I really enjoyed our meeting together. Your resume is impressive. Your willingness to come back into government to serve the country that you love. To be honest, your resume is maybe not the one that we had expected to receive for this position. We have a president who has no diplomatic experience, a Secretary of State who has no diplomatic experience, and while you have extensive experience running the operations of government, you don't have direct diplomatic experience either. And so these questions about the reorganization of the department, which I assume you will be riding herd over, are really critical, given the fact that I think, as you've acknowledged, you are unlikely to be sent out around the world as a frontline diplomat, given that your responsibilities will largely be in helping to run the operations of a very large department. So you took this job understanding that there was a reorganization that was going to be undertaken. I think you've done a good job of articulating what you think the core mission of the State Department is, but this reorganization is done under the principle that the State Department has departed from the core mission. That's what the Secretary of State has said, and his belief is we need to get back to the core mission. So explain to me your view of how the State Department has departed from its core mission, thus necessitating this reorganization.
Well, I would characterize it, Senator Murphy. Well, first of all, thank you for our discussion yesterday. I very much enjoyed it. I think the world has changed in the 21st century, and our State Department and the way it's organized hasn't changed. The Defense Department has, in my experience in government, has reorganized several times in the same time frame in which the State Department has not. And let me give you an example of an area where I think we need to focus on management issues, and that's the intersection of our regional bureaus, which we need to have, obviously, and the functional bureaus that have been created and multiplied over time as issues have arisen. I think the interconnection between those two, and to make sure that they are united in promoting our common interests, national security and economic prosperity, is an area where we really need to focus. And so it's not so much that I think the world has changed. We have added functional bureaus, for example, as issues have arisen, but we haven't integrated our approach to this new world with new technologies, new means of communication, new threats, transnational threats, that are much different from the world that existed, say, in the mid-1990s.
So I agree. I think that's exactly the problem. The world has changed, and while we have seen some of our adversaries beef up their military capacity, what has really changed is the panoply of non-military threats, or at least threats that are not conventional military threats that are presented to the United States. Disease epidemics, famine, online terrorist organizations recruiting lone wolf attackers, global warming, creeping corruption. And yet what worries me is that given the fact that the world has changed and all of these non-military threats have multiplied, this reorganization essentially has been predetermined by a president who has called for a 30% reduction in the capacity of the State Department while calling for a $50 billion investment in the Department of Defense. So given the fact that the world has changed, and I think you would agree that the number of non-military threats presented to the United States has multiplied, how can you take on a job of reorganization which you have said is not prejudged in its outcome, given the fact that the President of the United States, your boss and Secretary Tillerson's boss, is commanding you to conduct that reorganization through a means that results in thousands of layoffs and dramatic cuts to the department? How is the outcome here not predetermined, that the reorganization is essentially just an excuse to slash and burn the department?
Well, Senator, I would repeat that the outcome from the Secretary's perspective is not preordained. For example, on job cuts that you mentioned, I know from speaking to the Secretary, there is no decision made on either, despite what's been reported in the press on particular numbers of job cuts and so forth. What the Secretary has undertaken is a review of the mission of the department to make sure that the workflows, the work product of that department meets those missions and is we are organized in a way to accomplish those missions in the most efficient and accountable way possible. And that's my commitment to you, Senator.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Again, I really appreciate your willingness to serve. This is a very tough job, but your willingness to continue to talk to us gives me confidence that we can build on the conversations we've had. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
If I could, so personally, I think having top to bottom reviews are good things for everyone. I will say the reason that the State Department's being cut by 30% in this initial budget is that the real drivers of our deficits are unwilling to be looked at. And so administration appears to me is looking at a department that many people around America believe doesn't spend its money well. For some reason, Americans think we spend 25% of our money on on aid and other diplomacy efforts when we spend 1%. And I think we've done a pretty good job recently causing people to understand the importance of this. Fortunately, our military generals have done the same. But I do think it's incumbent upon all of us to not just make sure we're spending the dollars well, and certainly food aid reform and those kind of things should be undertaken. But I think as a committee to point out that to the extent we don't carry out these activities, our men and women in uniform that we respect and admire are more likely going to be in harm's way. And I think we've done a pretty good job of that recently. But let's face it, the skinny budget came out because this administration nor Congress is willing to deal with the major drivers of deficits. And it was a way of looking as if we were addressing deficits when we're really not. That's what's happening here, and I think it's incumbent upon us to understand that's what's happening. Senator Paul.
Congratulations on your nomination and welcome. There's been some discussion of sort of whether or not diplomacy or our country's policy should be the spreading of human rights and the somehow vanquishing of human rights abusers around the world as our policy, or whether it should be more realistic. There have been many voices saying, well, we really needs to be the preeminent part of our foreign policy to vanquish those who are human rights abusers. But I guess while we're all for that, and we're all for the notion that we wish there weren't these human rights abuses around the world, sometimes I think that policy leads to unintended consequences. So, for example, was Colonel Gaddafi a human rights abuser? I don't probably think there's any question he probably was. Would we wish there'd be someone better involved in running Libya? Yes. But after his negotiating away his nuclear weapons, there are some ramifications that we're still living with. The West toppled him anyway. The message that sent to North Korea and the message that sent to Iran was, you know what, if you get rid of your nuclear weapons, you may well be toppled by the West. And so I guess my question to you is, in balancing sort of the realism of how the world is and how we see it with human rights, would you say that there were unintended consequences of toppling Gaddafi in Libya?
Absolutely, Senator. I think we're seeing them on a daily basis.
Same would go with regard to Iraq. Hussein was accused of gassing the Kurds, using chemical weapons. We've had another instance of that now. And so everybody would say, well, Hussein was a terrible person we should get rid of. The problem is it also led to unintended consequences that I think now the same people who want to get rid of Hussein now want to get rid of the government of Iran, and Iran is emboldened because of the counterbalance of Iraq being gone. So to every action there is a reaction, and an unintended one. And I think that it's important that we have people involved in the State Department who understand that your job, as I see it, is diplomacy, not war. It doesn't say we don't have military might and that we don't have the expression of that and the potential threat of that, but we've got plenty of voices for that. My hope is that yours will be a voice for diplomacy and that you recognize that is your role or the job description, a part of it other than the management of the State Department, is that the State Department in general is supposed to be about diplomacy. And if you could comment on sort of the role of the State Department in diplomacy in general terms, I'd appreciate it.
Certainly. Thank you, Senator Paul. Yes, I think that is emphatically the mission of the State Department, and I think our Secretary of Defense, Secretary Mattis, would agree with that. And I was originally nominated to work for Secretary Mattis at the Defense Department. I have a fundamentally different job at the State Department, fundamentally different mission, which I'm committed to. With respect to our most recent discussions, I think that concerns about the use of military force in forcing regime change, for example, are very serious concerns. Use of military force should only be as a last resort when our national interests are vital national interests are at stake, but there's no diminution of our commitment to our fundamental values as Americans, on which our foreign policy, our diplomacy, that you and I agree should be at the heart of what we do, is based.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think that's the point in the discussion of realism versus human rights. We should never shy away from saying and representing and being this symbol of freedom and liberty around the world and justice. But at the same time, if we as our foreign policy say we are going to topple every regime that has a human rights abuse, we'll be at war with about 50 countries right now. And the unintended consequences, one, of bankrupting the country, but two, of getting us involved in wars for which we have no answer and there is no end, would be interminable. So I think the overall debate on realism, and many have tried to sort of cast aspersions on Tillerson's comments, but I think he was recognizing that there is a balance. We never give up on what we stand for, and that we are this shining light as a free nation, but we also don't need to be naive enough that we think that we are somehow the descendants of Wilsonian, let's make the world safe for democracy. If we're unwilling to look at the ramifications of our involvement around the world, and particularly getting involved in another war in Yemen, whether it will be better or worse for us, I have cautioned that in Yemen I have a fear that we get involved in a war that both sides are beaten down and Al-Qaeda shows up the same way ISIS showed up in Syria, ready to pick up the pieces of the chaos there. And that if we don't think that through in advance and don't think that there got to be a diplomatic arm to our government, that we're making a big mistake. But I wish you well, and I hope you will be one of the sane voices for diplomacy.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. Senator Markley.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for placing yourself forward for this responsibility. I wanted to ask you about the Paris Agreement that's under discussion right now. A tremendously high percentage of the world's governments have joined up for voluntary commitments to try to address the issue of carbon pollution and its impact on a warming planet. And the question is, should we be in or out? 1,000 companies have weighed in with the State Department to say we should be in, including oil companies, ExxonMobil and ConocoPhillips. What do you think? Should we be in the Paris Agreement? Should we stay in or otherwise?
Thank you, Senator Merkley. I understand that there is an ongoing discussion within the administration and within the interagency on continued participation in the Paris Agreement. There are complex issues, as you know better than I, including legal issues with respect to Article 4.11 and so forth. I haven't been involved in those discussions, but what I would say to you, Senator, is my view as a general matter is that the United States is best served and its interests protected when it has a seat at the table, as a general matter. Now, with respect to the Paris Agreement, I haven't been involved in the discussions. I know that they're ongoing, but that's my general approach, Senator.
And that is the point that the Secretary of State has made, and the point he is arguing, that we should keep a seat at the table. In keeping a seat at the table, we can either, since the agreements are non-binding, we can either seek to uphold the pledges that we made, or we can ignore those. If we do stay at the table, should we seek to honor the pledges we made for reducing our carbon dioxide production?
I understand that there is both a policy and a legal component to that question, Senator. I have not been involved in the discussions on that and have not studied those issues in sufficient detail to provide you with a definitive answer today. I would be happy, if confirmed, to focus and to participate in that discussion with you personally, if confirmed.
Let me turn to North Korea. We've had statements coming out of the administration from different individuals, some arguing that primarily military pressure is going to make the difference, and we have the carrier strike group positioned off North Korea. We have others saying that the pressure from China is going to make the difference. We have others saying that we are laying the ground for negotiations. All of this creates a wide space for potential miscommunication, which could lead to events spiraling out of control. Should it be the State Department that's taking the lead in creating a clear, consolidated message to avoid misunderstandings?
Yes, Senator, and I think that that's the primary function of the State Department, is to be the Secretary of State, to be the President's principal foreign policy advisor and spokesperson on U.S. foreign policy. Having said that, I think the Secretary's approach to North Korea, and he's been very clear about this, is that our goal is to have a denuclearized Korean peninsula. That is our objective, and we're going to use all the means at our disposal, our national power, to accomplish that in working with allies, partners, and others. The use of other